All right, in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get rolling. I think everyone will agree our opening panel is going to be a hard act to follow, but I have no doubt that this group is up to the task. You'll notice that our agenda is not haphazard, so we've strategically designed it to kind of start high level and talk about some of the most pressing challenges facing the globe, really, at a very high level, and how we can work together to think about those problems and develop solutions. We're now going to sort of narrow our discussion somewhat and talk about the two largest river systems in the country, the Colorado and the Mississippi, and some of the unique challenges that those two systems present in terms of risk and also the kind of human dimension. So I would like to turn things over to our moderator for this panel, Ann Castle. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly, and good morning, everybody. I want to add my thanks to the conference organizers for bringing all of you together and for instigating this conversation that I think is incredibly valuable and hopefully productive. My name is Ann Castle. I'm with the Natural Resources Law Center at the University of Colorado. And we're going to talk about today with these panelists very much a follow-on to the initial panel. Very much the same themes: governance, funding, federal involvement, the role of science, how do you involve stakeholders? But we're going to talk about them in the context of specific, on-the-ground, how do we do it in the Colorado and the Mississippi River basins. Let me introduce to you the folks that you're going to be hearing from. To my left is Norma Mattei. She's a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of New Orleans. She's also one of just 3 civilian engineers on the Mississippi River Commission, the commission that advises Congress and the executive branch on river operations in the entirety of that basin that covers 40% or more of our country. She has been involved in a number of STEM education organizations. She's been involved in the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority and in the licensing board for engineers in Louisiana. To her left is Mike Connor, who is a partner with the global law firm of WilmerHale. Mike served in the Department of the Interior for the entire 8 years of the Obama administration. He was the Deputy Secretary of Interior, the second in command, and the Chief Operating Officer of Interior. He also served as the Commissioner of Reclamation during the first half of the Obama administration, and was water counsel to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and director of the Indian Water Rights Office at Interior. So he's held a number of different positions there. He now specializes in Indian law, natural resources, and environmental law with the WilmerHale firm. And then on your far right is Sarah Porter, who is the director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University, named after former Senator John Kyle. Sarah was the inaugural director of the Kyle Center starting in 2015. Before that, she served for 9 years as the executive director of Audubon, Arizona. She's also a lawyer and was a commercial litigator for many years and clerked on the Ninth Circuit. So we have a lot of expertise in both the Colorado and Mississippi River basins. I was also in the Department of the Interior during part of the Obama administration. I was the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science and had experience particularly with the Colorado River Basin, but a number of river basins all over the country. So that's our lineup. We've talked about internally many of the same things that you heard about earlier from kind of a higher level, but I'm going to turn to Norma Jean and ask her to introduce herself a little bit more and talk to you about some of the things that she thinks are important to know and how those ideas about governance and funding and infrastructure have been playing out in your experience.
Well, thank you. Good morning, and thank you again to those folks that had played a part of putting the summit on. The order of the weather, really, you did a wonderful job. I actually am a native New Orleanian. I am Dean of Engineering at the University of New Orleans. I'm actually the immediate past president of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and one of the speakers from the previous panel mentioned that ASCE has given infrastructure on a whole. If you know the report card, how many of you know have seen the report card on infrastructure? 16 categories, not all of them water. D+ overall, not so good. A lot of the water categories also not very good. In fact, the best grade is freight, and that freight also is primarily public. So freight rail is public. It had gotten the highest grade of B, and that was because of private investment. So money matters. So we're really focused today on water, and I'm going to focus on the watershed of the Mississippi River. It's a pretty big watershed. If you look behind me, the continental U.S., it's a little bit hard to see, but the lighter green, the whole middle of the country, including some slivers of 2 Canadian provinces, drained by the mighty Mississippi, right there. So how do you safely live on the banks of the mighty Mississippi? And it's been there a long time. We as a nation grew, and we grew economically because of the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The governor said that Baton Rouge was not part of the purchase, and I thought, hey, wait a minute, I know the boundaries. So I Googled it. Spain retained the fort of Baton Rouge. Isn't that interesting? So once the United States, as a fledgling, not quite a superpower, in fact, just a struggling baby nation back in 1803, purchased the Louisiana Purchase, it controlled the Mississippi. So it was important because whoever controlled the Mississippi, especially the mouth of the Mississippi, was going to have that power, that economic power, and also that military power, because we moved things by water back then. We still move heavy things by water today. Flash forward to 1879, the Mississippi River Commission was created by Congress, and it was because of the mouth of the Mississippi. Shoaling issues at the mouth. There was disagreement between civil engineers, one a military engineer, a general, and one a civilian engineer, Eads. If you live in St. Louis, you might know the Eads Bridge. He actually made his fortune salvaging sunken vessels in the Mississippi. So Eads thought we should open the South Pass by keep it open by using jetties and some other structures that would channelize the water so that it would self-cleanse. And the general wanted to dredge a canal, and Eads said, and it was kind of a public-private partnership, he said, I believe in this so much that I will get the money, put that out there. If it works, you owe me. If it doesn't, oops. It worked. So the commission is made up of 3 Army generals, 1 now NOAA admiral, and 3 civilians, 2 of which have to be civilian engineers. And it's still in existence today. I serve as one of the commissioners appointed by President Obama. And we steward the Mississippi River and Tributaries project. Now, how many of you know of the MR&T project? So few people. That project was put into existence or authorized by Congress after the great flood of the 1920s. So in 1927, a disaster was what was the impetus of putting together this very large project. So you see a very large watershed, you see the red splotch, that is the MR&T project. So the MR&T project is prosecuted by this 7-person commission, and by federal law, we travel as commissioners twice a year to inspect the project. But also, we have public meetings twice a year where we are on a boat, a large work vessel on the Mississippi. We travel from Missouri all the way down to the mouth of the Mississippi, or close to the mouth of the Mississippi, and we meet with the public. So that includes governors, that includes at the federal level, senators and congressmen and women and their staff, but it also can include someone who likes to canoe the Mississippi, or a company that wants to develop a kayaking business, or a bike path along the MR&T levee system. So it's a way for people who make decisions on a very large project that was initially authorized for flood control purposes. Also stewards navigation, has environmental aspects, and a little bit of recreation thrown in there. And you've got all of those stakeholders coming to tell you why they value the river. And you get to listen to them. And you get to put into your mind, as a steward of a very large project, where those different pieces fit in to the big puzzle. So it's been a very interesting position to be in.
So that's a really interesting model of governance that's in use for some of the operational aspects of the Mississippi. Why don't we turn now to Mike? You can talk a little bit about governance in the Colorado system and your thoughts about what's working and what's not.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Anne, for the kind introduction. I would just start by also acknowledging I was fortunate in my federal career at the Department of the Interior to have great bosses, great secretaries. Secretary Salazar when I was Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner, as well as Secretary Jewell when I was Deputy Secretary. But I also had a third boss, Ann Castle, when I was running the Bureau of Reclamation, and I would add her to the list of great, great bosses. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be back with Ann, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today. Thank you for the conference organizers for including me. First time to Baton Rouge. I would just a quick little bit expansion about my background. I grew up on the I-10 corridor. And thank you very much, Secretary, for mentioning Las Cruces, New Mexico, which didn't make the map, but is where I grew up. So it's the arid side of the I-10 corridor, and literally on a stone's throw from the banks of a major canal on the Rio Grande project down in that part of the country. I didn't have to worry about the levees or anything else in that part of the country, being a stone's throw from a major delivery system, but it does, water is in my background, particularly this corridor. And lucky through my professional experiences to be able to work in all the major river basins along the corridor, the Colorado River Basin, certainly the Rio Grande Basin, particularly during my time working for Jeff Bingaman in the U.S. Senate, in focusing not just on his role as chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, but also as a New Mexico senator. A lot of the Mississippi tributaries, reclamation projects are on Platte River, Arkansas River, Missouri River, obviously, but I'm glad never having to deal with the scale of the Mississippi as a whole. In government, you oftentimes try to build your bureaucracies. I was not one who wanted to take over the Corps of Engineers. It was hard enough to worry about the Bureau of Reclamation. And then even all the way to the Apalachicola during my time as Deputy Secretary and working on the Restore Council and those set of activities. And I mention that just because I think the I-10 corridor has all examples of how you can either make great progress through collaboration And I think we've done that in the Colorado River Basin, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. I'm interested in learning more about the Mississippi River Basin. But I also know it has examples of how to have basic uncertainty and unrest through ongoing conflict. There have only been 2 recent cases argued before the U.S. Supreme Court over water allocation issues amongst the states. The Rio Grande battle between Texas and New Mexico, argued in January of this year before the Supreme Court, and the Apalachicola, also argued on the same day in January before the U.S. Supreme Court. So you've got every example along this corridor, and I'm glad we're going to focus on places where we've made progress and built alliances. In talking about when we were having our pre-discussion about the panel, Anne asked us to think about, what are ingredients, elements of success in making progress, in building resiliency. And so I came up with my own version based on primarily the Colorado River experience of key elements to making progress on basin-wide issues. And for me, defining progress is building resiliency to a multitude of issues affecting water resource matters in a particular basin. So whether it's population growth and its demands on water, whether it's overuse, particularly with respect to groundwater and the unsustainability of that aspect. If it's, then you've just got the changing nature of water. A lot of it's driven by climate change and extreme storm events to just pure temperature increases and what that means for water, as well as the changing nature of how water comes to us, less snowpack, more precipitation, et cetera. So it's all those factors that have raised a number of challenges, particularly in the Colorado River Basin. So here's my key elements, which I'm sure can be debated, expanded upon, and reduced, but they're mine. So my first one is you've got to have forums for resolving issues that are structured around decision makers, people who can bind key entities. Obviously, the states are part of that, but major water suppliers and institutions that are involved in any particular river basin. There are a multitude of stakeholders, but I think it's particularly key that there be some fundamental forum or structure where those entities can constantly interact with each other. In the Colorado River Basins, it's called the 7 basin states. And it's obviously the 7 basin states that are represented on the map there, and they do have a structure that allows them to constantly interact, but it's really actually the 7 basin states plus. It includes key water management entities such as Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, Central Arizona Water Conservation District, Southern Nevada Water Authority, and of course the Bureau of Reclamation as the major operating entity. So that's the fundamental forum that exists, and it's a mechanism to bind people and to make agreements and solve problems, quite frankly. At the same time, element number 2, decision-making forums have to be transparent, inclusive, and grounded in science. And I think it's an ongoing process in the Colorado River Basin, but that 7 basin states plus entity has done an increasingly better job of working with NGOs, of working with the ag communities, with municipalities. And in that basin in particular, Indian tribes and now the Republic of Mexico have become key entities, and there are processes, both informal and formal, to engage those entities and to engage them on facts, science, data, which define the challenges that exist in the basin. Third element, decision makers need to be committed to sustainability as a guiding management principle, not legal positions. I don't know when that came about in the Colorado River Basin, which Mark Reisner wrote about in Cadillac Desert as the most litigated, most legislated, fought about river in the entire world. It's much different now. Somewhere in the 90s, I think the states recognized the mutual risk in their legal positions and decided that they would work on the ground practical solutions. And they've done that quite well over the last 20 years. Fourth element is a strong and defined federal role I'll tread lightly there. It's very unique in the Colorado River Basin because the Secretary of the Interior is the water master and has a lot of authority in the lower basin, which is unique. And with that comes the need for judicious use of that authority to push people, to facilitate, to convene, but not to dictate. That's the key to success there. I think my fifth element is the willingness to make progress on bite-sized pieces. I can look over the last 20 years and just even on the plane over here last night, quickly wrote down 15 significant agreements in the last 20 years that involve, some of which involved a few stakeholders, some of them which involved the entire basin, all states, all major water users needed to be signed off by the other stakeholders. Even in the more localized agreements, though, typically they did require sign-off by a larger segment of the basin. And then my sixth and final is that decision makers and stakeholders in the basin need to be politically savvy, but politically wary. And I think in the Colorado River Basin, one of the major benefits that all the stakeholders and decision makers have had is let's bring the politicians solutions that they need to celebrate, act on, to help implement. Let's keep our disputes out of that political arena, and I think that's a key element of success there.
Thank you. Great elements. I was wishing I had a pencil. Let's hear from Sarah. Sarah, we'd like to get your perspective on maybe some of the things that Mike just mentioned in the Colorado, but also particularly from Arizona's standpoint. The Colorado River Basin is at a tipping point right now in terms of trying to come together around an agreement for allocation. Arizona is probably more challenged than any of the other basin states to come together around that agreement. So tell us what you think about that and give us your perspective.
Well, thank you. And I first want to say that I feel really humbled and honored to be sitting here with the three of you, and especially as someone from the West, two real giants of Colorado River management, Ann and Mike. And I want to add that your years of involvement in the Colorado River management were really halcyon years. A very important agreement was decided in that time. You put us on the path to future agreements, and those I think will go down in history as really important years. I also want to add, I'm a native Phoenician, so just sitting here and having this perspective, it's giving me incredible water envy. I'm sitting here and thinking, like, how many minutes does it take for the water supply of Phoenix to roll past? You know, it's just really hard for me to be here. No, in response, and more directly to your question, I don't have 6 points. I only have 3. But I'd start by saying that as the last panel observed, local management appears to be most effective in addressing pressing problems. Local responses, and that's really true in water. The best management of water is closest. It tends to be the closest to the users. And yet, in a watershed, in watersheds like this, obviously we can't rely on local management. So there's an interesting tension between wanting to allow local management, where we see a lot of innovation, and also the need for a larger scale, possibly sometimes top-down management. And you know, Arizonans aren't famous for loving top-down, heavy-handed water management solutions or any kind of solutions. But at the same time as there's that tension, there's a tension between wanting to have agreements and laws and compacts in place, and the problem that those agreements and laws and compacts tend to be obsolete very quickly, and they tend to be hidebound. So we really have this difficulty of how to strike a balance between those two things. And second, I hope if there's one message that I convey today to you all, I hope this is it, and that is that, and this is like a Buddhist koan, Shortage is the new normal, and there's plenty of water in the Colorado River system to support growth and food security and thriving economies. For the last 40+ years, economic and population growth have been decoupled from water demand. The cities in the Southwest are some of the fastest growing cities. No one has ever awakened in the morning and found that there was no water coming out of the tap. We have to continue to have not only faith in the technology and the innovations in policy that have fostered this decoupling, but I think we need to keep our eye on it, we need to promote it, and we really need to be sure to continue to invest in that. And to that same point, shortage is the new normal and there's plenty of water. There's a great deal of give in the system. So policy innovations have allowed us to see things like dry year agreements between cities and growers so that farms will fallow some of their fields and allow some of their extra water to go to cities during times of shortage. There are opportunities for large, high-priority water users to be part of the solution. In particular, in the Colorado Basin, in particular in the lower basin, we have tribes with very large, high-priority water rights, and they've expressed a desire to be part of the solution. Very movingly, recently, I heard Governor Lewis of the Gila River Indian community express that the Gila community and other tribes have experienced what it's like not to have water, and they're very motivated not to let that happen to other communities. So they want to be part of the solution. We do have policies and hidebound old laws that get in the way of their participating as part of the solution. And then finally, you mentioned and the kind of the drama that we've seen recently in Arizona. There is an agreement that's on the table. It took a lot of work among the Colorado Basin states, especially the lower basin states, to come to an agreement on how to manage Lake Mead, the reservoir that serves Arizona, Nevada, California, and Mexico, to avoid Lake Mead from dropping to catastrophic levels. So there's this agreement on the table, and I had the pleasure of attending a series of meetings convened by our governor, Doug Ducey, and got to learn about this agreement in excruciating detail. And it really strikes me that this is a brilliant agreement about accounting. It's about water accounting more than anything else. Usually people think it's an agreement about how to share cuts. It's really an agreement about accounting so that people can conserve water in the reservoir in Lake Mead. And it looked like, I would say as of November 2016, it looked as though we were going to all join hands and sail into the legislature in Arizona and gain approval for Arizona's participation in this agreement. And that all fell apart when we really came to the very end. And I'm like, all these people from Arizona are almost like, they're laughing. They're like, ha, ha, ha. But the problem was that the agency that conveys Colorado River water 330 miles across the state to Phoenix and Tucson and other cities in central Arizona, its needs weren't met. It was feeling that it had needs that were not going to be met by this agreement. And so that agency pretty much was able to stop the agreement from being approved in 2016. It's kind of interesting because Secretary Cisneros observed that it takes many to accomplish something, but one individual can stop this. Well, it wasn't one human individual, but to some extent, it's this one agency that has really been the holdout when many of its, not all of them, there are some who side with CAP or CAWCD, but cities and tribes and other contract holders are frustrated because they feel that their best interests would be served by having Arizona quickly ratify DCP. And this all goes to this drama has been really interesting for water geeks, and it's been on the front pages of the newspaper, and so anyone who's doing anything in water policy in Arizona is fielding questions from non-water experts all the time about, are we about to run out of water, thanks to the coverage that it's getting. But most recently, the upper basin water managers, so from Colorado and points north, have they've expressed through very formal letters to the Department of Water Resources and through editorials their dismay at what they feel is kind of bad acting by the CAP, that the Central Arizona Water Conservation District is trying to game the system. That's the phrase they use. And so we've recently had, very recently, a big shift in at least the PR from CAWCD, who's done a tour of, to meet with water managers, and in the headlines were that CAP has now been conciliatory. So we don't know how it's going to shake out, but this is all to say that when you're in the process, you can look at it and say, I think this is breaking down. I think we're about to have something really catastrophic happen. And it would not be good for Central Arizona if we had a shortage declaration on Lake Mead. And yet at the same time, it might be working. It might be working when we have expressions of dismay from Upper Basin water managers and a tour of atonement from the CAP. We don't know yet.
Walk of shame.
Trying not to go there. But it really has been interesting for me to see, because we can look back at the 2007 guidelines, we can look back on the Colorado Compact, we can look back on all these historic points where the Colorado River states and Mexico reached important agreements. But when you're in the middle of it, as we are, especially in the state of Arizona, it's very hard to tell if the process is working or not.
Thank you, Sarah. That's very perceptive, I think. All of you have touched on governance, and how do you structure governance in these very, very large systems where you need some unifying authority to operate them? Norma Jean talked about the Mississippi River Commission. Mike, I want to start with you and maybe challenge your statement that all governance needs to be transparent. And that's a mantra, right? We're all for transparency. In the Colorado River Basin, though, you will frequently hear the basin states, the 7 states, and usually they're represented by one official who's appointed by the governor to represent the state on Colorado River water matters. They will say, we can't come to agreement in the open. We have to hash it out in a closed room and then come out of that closed room and work with stakeholders. So I'm interested in your thoughts about the transparency issue in general, and then I want to hear from both Sarah and Norma Jean about how that translates in other situations.
Thank you for the softball. I think overall, you're absolutely right. I view it like kind of a spectrum, and that's why the first 2 elements were basically you need somebody, some entity at the end of the day that can come together and make decisions based on, as open a process as possible, where they've thoroughly taken the time to thoroughly understand the different interests of the different constituencies. And it is a balancing act. I think the progress that's been made along those lines in recent times is that for every closed door meeting in which there maybe are 10 to 20 individuals negotiating and being ready to make compromises and structuring an agreement that they can take back to their principals, that now there is at least 3 times, 4 times as much work in between meetings with people going out to meeting with those different constituencies and trying to, one, just bring some level of sunshine into the process and what are the issues that are being discussed, as well as taking input that they can incorporate and bring to the negotiating table so that those entities can see their interests somehow being put forward. And I'll give the perfect example is the 2 agreements that we made with Mexico on the Colorado River. Minutes 318 and minutes 319. And minutes are just itemized agreements under the overall structure of the 1944 treaty. And they're just called minutes. But one thing, the 7 basin states had operated in a very closed door type structure for a long time. The US-Mexico negotiations were very formal and very unwieldy for a long time. And one of the elements, particularly Minute 319, it was a 3-part deal that looked at ways to incentivize binational investments in conservation to kind of stretch water supply, to define operating rules in case there are shortages. The states had done that amongst themselves, but were irritated that Mexico had not been brought into that part of the solution. So that was another element of that deal. And then the last element was the environmental aspect. How do we store the Colorado River Delta? We could not get everybody to agree to bring the NGOs to the negotiating table itself, but we all spent a lot of time recognizing, particularly Mexico wanted that environmental aspect in that deal. And so we all spent a lot of time working between every meetings, working with the NGOs, apprising them of the process, taking their input, and we ultimately, that's the third element of that deal. So it was outside the room, but it was a critical part, and it was why when we brought the agreement out to the open, there were some naysayers, but there were relatively few naysayers, particularly for an agreement of that magnitude.
So Norma Jean, how would you relate that to your experience in the Mississippi River Basin? You talked about the commission listening both to the federal agencies, to state delegations, but also to the promoters of the bike path and the person who canoes on the river. Do you see it in terms of like concentric circles of governance, or how does that work in the Mississippi?
Well, it's not quite as bad as whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. Because the project spans 6 different states, but because it began its life back in the 20s, the states were new. I can't remember when Louisiana became a state, but I think it was not that old. I don't know when Colorado became a state. So in the 1800s. So you had states that this project was the commission was relatively young, but when the states were young, and then the project was created spanning 6 states, and I don't know how easy it would be to have that happen again, because the states would want the authorities. And we do have a Upper Mississippi group, a group of states that look at the MR&T project, so those states that are parts of Missouri that are outside of it, north of the project. And they envy it not for the water to drink or for ag purposes, but primarily for the flood control that it allows and for reliable navigation, because you can meter out the water. And so they want a very similar project in the Upper Mississippi. But it's very hard for all of those stakeholders to come together and realize that you're going to have to give and take. So you're going to have to come to the table, be transparent, and understand that you're not going to get everything that you want, but you can get some of it. And when you talk about flood control, sometimes a large project, you don't tell the Mississippi most people see the levees, they know that it's dammed, they see locks, they see all of this man-made infrastructure, and we keep the Mississippi where we want it, and that's not true. So in major extreme events, we allow the river to overflow, but it's a designed flooding. So there are 3 floodways that are opened, one more often than others. That was the Bonnet Carré, but one in New Madrid that floods farmland. Farmland people have to, if they have a pig farm, they've got to get their pigs out. It's only been operated once, 2011. and then the Morganza, which has been operated for its authorized purpose once. It was operated another time in order to eliminate some risk of foundation to an old river structure that was just downstream. So it was actually opened once, not for its authorized purpose, but to eliminate stress on a large piece of infrastructure. And so you have to then accept flooding in certain areas for extreme events, and nobody wants to accept that. Sure. So that when you have the big one, you're protected. And it's just that, when are you going to get the big one? So, and if you do have this type of a system, you can get protection from flooding from the nuisance floods or from the 10-year floods. You'll only flood when there's the big one. And you also have to assess what is going to happen with the environment, with your native species, or you're going to have invasive species issues. So there's a lot of moving parts. And everybody has to come together, realize that you can't have everything, but you can get something if you work together. But you have to develop trust.
Trust, I think, is a huge part of any governance structure, and relationships. And those are hard to, they build up over time. So Sarah, I would ask you, again, on the governance theme, is there a breakdown of the governance structure that has caused the Arizona challenges? Do we need a different one in the Colorado River Basin to try to get past this?
I think the governance structure among the basin states is really robust, and it has worked, and I don't have any reason to think it won't continue to work. At a more local level in Arizona, and especially in the case of what by shorthand I'll call CAP, we definitely have an issue with governance. And it actually kind of goes to this question of transparency and trust. The Central Arizona Project, which is formerly known as the Central Arizona Water Conservation District, has a different governance from other water authorities in the Colorado Basin. It's governed by a popularly elected board who come from the 3 counties that are served by this big, giant 330-mile ditch. And I strongly suspect that part of the reason we've had so much trouble getting everyone to come together on the very important drought contingency proposal is that where the buck stops with CAP, we don't have a set of experts who really can independently assess the impacts of not passing, not agreeing to the proposal, not compromising. So to me, it's a big question. Is the governance at that level working? And I would say probably it could be improved by having more water experts be on that board. Most water authorities in the West have either all representatives of customers on their board, or they have a hybrid of representatives of customers and then other people, maybe popularly elected. But we have this popularly elected board, and I think there's probably a tendency for people on such boards to naturally rely very heavily on staff. Who else do you go to? And it's through no one's fault, but it means that important outside perspective that comes from being an independent board member probably isn't activated in the way that it should be.
That's really perceptive. Let's turn to talk about science. Mayor Broom mentioned that we had to base our river operations on the best science available. But there's various forms of science. There's lots of data, and people often disagree about what's the right science, what's the right data set, what does the data show. We've got 3 lawyers on this panel who have, and you are as well, Right. You're the odd person out, Norma Jean. But you know that in water litigation, there's frequently disagreements about what science should we be using. So let me throw the question out to each of you. How do we get people to agree on what data are we going to use, what data source is going to be trusted or regarded as unbiased and definitive? How do we come to agreement around the science? Sarah, do you want to start with that?
I guess my answer would be, I'm not sure, but I see that this is probably the most serious problem regarding water management in the West, and it probably starts with engagement at an early stage and not coming to the stakeholders with your body of science. Here it is, we've figured it out. You're in groundwater deficit, and climate change is going to mean that flows are reduced by 30 or 50%. So I think that would be engage stakeholders early in understanding the process and in answering their requests for science or data. And then the second thing is, I think it is troubling that some of the important data sets we do have huge variance in conclusions. And so I had a reporter call me a couple weeks ago to say, what do you think about a recent study that the flows in the Colorado are going to be reduced by 55%? And I said, we have to pay attention to that, but I also could look at the United States studies that project flows at, reduction at a much lower rate due to climate change. So there's a loss of credibility when we have extreme variations in conclusions based on scientific modeling. And it's very hard to get people to sort of identify the problem and focus on it when experts are giving us such different information to work from.
Norma Jean, you're essentially a science advisor on the Mississippi River Commission in many ways, I would say. How do you view this issue?
Well, as an engineer who uses science as a tool, you want the best science to inform your decisions as an engineer. So often what you do is use say if it's sea level rise, what seems to be the high end, what seems to be the low end, see what that does to what you're trying to either design or assess, or if you're operating. What does that do to this decision that you're trying to make? And is it sensitive to that? And so if it is, then you're going to have to continuously modify what you're doing, and so adapt as science pans out to not be the way that you had initially decided you were going to use that parameter. If it does not pan out that way, then you're going to have to modify what the decision that you made because it was based on faulty. Mm-hmm. Or sometimes, depending on the window that you're looking, so if you're forecasting into the future, 5 years isn't that far, 10 years isn't that far, but 50 years, 100 years, you understand that your crystal ball is going to be hazy, even with great science, because things you can't wrap your arms around all of the parameters. You can just do your best as a scientist or as an engineer. And so those forecasts that are long term, you really have to continually monitor how things are going and then make adjustments and adapt as things change, and if they're not looking like your initial decision was the right one.
So adaptive management, learning by doing, make that part of the process. Mike, your thoughts?
I think there's fundamentally a difference between science and data for management and science and data for regulations purposes. And I think my experience, I'm very fortunate in my experience having run the Bureau of Reclamation, where I could go to certain constituents. I'd go to Idaho and I'd say, hey, we're a regulated entity, just like you guys. and as opposed to running the Department of the Interior, where I was accountable for the Fish and Wildlife Service decisions under the Endangered Species Act and biological opinions that were restricting people's ability to do things, where the science was much more contentious. In the science for water management for an entity like the Bureau of Reclamation or the Corps of Engineers, my sense is that there's our ongoing relationships with state entities and the federal role, I think, in that particular context, to bring funding and resources to the table and work in collaboration in developing models, basic science, monitoring stations, gauging stations. That type of stuff allows you to kind of build a network of science and data that people don't want to compete with each other on. They just want to add to the very good science as best as possible, and the states take their role. They'll willingly help the federal government spend resources to develop even better science. But overall, whether it was the Colorado River Basin or California Bay Delta, people had come to accept the operation models of reclamation because they had lots of input into it. They all had access to it. They could all run it just as well as reclamation came. And there was some, ability to replicate results. And so there was just trust. I'm like you said, I don't know how that all came about. I just think we were the beneficiary of it in a lot of cases, that there wasn't a whole lot of debate about the science. But I also think we tried to take it, once again, in bite-sized pieces. We understand, we took the state's data on demands for water, we integrated science that projected some level of reductions over time because of climate change and temperatures. In and of itself, over the next decade, that demonstrated a gap between supply and demand, and we all had to put it together strategies to fill that gap or to deal with that gap. And then you get out 50 years and the gap makes you want to go, put the covers over your head and go into another line of business. But when you work on, you can do it for a 10-year plan and integrate that adaptive management. And I think that's kind of the role, to keep going and keep trying to make progress.
I would also add that I think the science community's emphasis on or embrace of scenario planning can be both very, very helpful in working toward resilience and sustainability, but also helpful in engaging disparate views of what the right science, what the right data is. Because if you're scenario planning, that's something people can relate to in terms of, well, here's the worst case scenario, the 55% reduction. Here's some other pathways, but we have to plan in a way that will allow us to address all of those different scenarios. So I think it's one of those situations where you can be scientifically responsible, but in a way that tamps down the controversy among people who are promoting different data sets, different views of what the science should look like.
But one of the issues, I think, is that the federal, USGS or Bureau of Recommendation modeling that says maybe a 12% reduction in 20 years is not nearly as exciting for a reporter as 55% reduction. And so that's I totally agree about scenario planning, and I think that observation that you can bring in the stakeholders more easily, maybe it's the mind likes a story, so that's effective, but it is hard to control the models and scenarios that get splashed across the newspapers. Maybe that's not harmful, but those are the ones that we read about.
I think that goes back to Secretary Cisneros' point about managing the media and communications, that there's so much information out there. It's become a really significant challenge for leaders and managers to try to get the message out. So we all have to be aware of that. We've been talking for a while. We have another 20 minutes. So I want to open it up to questions. excuse me, from anyone in the audience. As was said in the previous panel, we have a lot of expertise here. So I see a question straight back here.
Thank you. I had a question about agriculture. As we talk about urbanization, and the last panel emphasized so much the sort of interest in green infrastructure, how do you address the role of agriculture on these two river basins, which are quite, agriculture is playing a major role here? There's great interest in, especially on the Mississippi River, I think, to reestablish deep wetlands, which would improve water quality and restore lost habitat. How do you deal with the debate of levees and agriculture versus removing levees and reestablishing wetlands? How do you address that?
Norma Jean, why don't you take that one first?
Oh, that's a softball. So when you look at agriculture along the Mississippi, it's a huge industry, and the amount of grain moved on so it's all perspective, because when you look at the population growth that we're expecting in the world, and you look at where grain and where food is grown, the breadbasket of the United States, which is right on top of that watershed, is what fed the US, but it's also feeding a significant portion of the world. And so there's been shifts in how farming and ag handles land. So there's precision land leveling that occurs. So containing, I don't know if one of your issues is fertilizer and phosphates moving down the waterways. I don't think the people that put the fertilizer on the ag lands want that to go into the waterway. So they want to contain it on the farms. So I think what we have to do is develop better techniques for farmers to keep fertilizer where they want it and not have it spill runoff and then ultimately get into the wetlands and into the rivers. That would mitigate some of it, and then you wouldn't have to use wetlands as much to filter that. I don't think that we'll be moving any of the mainline levees from the Mississippi, but some backwater areas, it can be looked at from a holistic point of view. So you have to take a look at that area that you might be interested in and look at it from the many different points of view to see what is the best way you can manage it, the problems, all of the problems.
The translation of that question to the Colorado River might be from loss of farmland to wetlands, constructed wetlands, instead loss of agriculture to cities, to take the water off the farmland, transfer to cities, or just reduce overall usage. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it was incredibly important in dealing with agriculture and to buy into the notion that we need to reinvest in agriculture. And from my perspective, I buy into the notion of we have to have our own food security here in this country. That's incredibly important. And so thinking about agriculture and how do we strengthen agriculture, recognizing, quite frankly, that market conditions will have an effect, that there will be a continual reduction, not necessarily, in the breadbasket of America, but out west, there are pockets of, traditional cultural agriculture, and there's still pockets of big agriculture down in the Yuma Valley, in the Imperial Valley. And so I think from my perspective, the way in dealing constructively with agriculture is don't talk about buy and dry, work with them on marketing opportunities, leasing water to help deal with shortage conditions that are part of their economic model that they can integrate into their operations. I'll fallow this much land this year or plan for that as part of my operations, and that'll give them some financial benefit. Reinvest in infrastructure where it makes sense to, make ag more efficient. But I thought it was very important from a governmental entity to try and acknowledge the importance of agriculture, recognizing we don't want to prop up agriculture where it's doesn't economically make sense. We've got to let some market, activity gradually change conditions and water use, because that's an important part of long-term sustainability. But there's a core level of agriculture that needs to be in place, and it's very important for this country.
I would also say that in most of the western states, we need to give agriculture more options. Our legal structure makes it difficult in many states to move water around. If we can loosen up the legal framework so that farmers and cities can share water, so that farmers can treat water as another commodity that they can manipulate on their farm, so that during very dry years they can be paid for that commodity by a city who can share the water, but that the farmer doesn't have to sell the farm or sell the water and go out of production permanently. We need those kinds of mechanisms in order to be able to ensure the future of agriculture, at least in the western states. I don't know if there's a corollary in the Mississippi in terms of the dichotomy between agricultural production and the need for additional riparian wetlands.
Well, from water for irrigation purposes? A lot of farmland in the middle part of the country was not irrigated. That has changed drastically. We've had a significant increase in productivity in the last few years, and I think part of that is driven by the fact that we're seeing more and more ag lands being irrigated. And we have a lot of surface water. We have a lot of water in that river, right? But 2011, we had a major flood that never saw the light of day media-wise because we passed it. The very next year, we had issues with low water on the same rivers. So a lot of climate issues there. So we're seeing that if you're not close to surface water, so that a farmer can't just take a small pump and pump it right over that levee, then they're probably using aquifers. And to me, I'll be honest with you, that's what scares me sitting where I sit, is that we're using aquifers, because I see what happened in the arid West, and we're not the arid Mississippi River watershed. We have a lot of water. We just don't have it always where we want it and when we want it. And we often have too much of it. So taking farms out of the aquifer so that we can keep the aquifers healthy and keep them for municipal water supply purposes, because Baton Rouge, New Orleans, we take our water right out of the river. That's why it tastes so good. But we get further away and they're taking it out of aquifers. And so how can we make sure that we keep the aquifers as healthy as they are? Because to be honest with you, I hear from people in certain areas that the aquifers are being depleted. And we're having great, we're having there's two very interesting projects in Arkansas looking at on-farm storage. So to get ag out of, and it's rice, so heavy water, get ag land out of the aquifer to get the aquifer to rebound by using water from the rivers. But they're not close to rivers. So you've got to man-made infrastructure, pumping stations, canals, pipelines to get that water, because we got a lot of it, just not where we want it, to get the surface water to the agricultural land so that we can get them out of the aquifer. Same goes for industry. So we have a lot of industry, steel's coming back to the United States because we have low energy prices. And so where do they need to be? On a big river. They need to move big, heavy things, so they need water for transportation, but they also need water for their processes. They use the water out of not the river, some of them out of the aquifer, because they don't have to treat it. But once they use it, they have to treat it. Thank you, EPA, which is good. Where do they dump it? Into the river. So how can we get these industries out of the aquifer and treat it before they use the water from the river, use it, treat it, put it back into the river?
We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Gus Kousoulis. I'm an Associate Vice President for Research and Economic Development for LSU. Thank you for all the very important points that you made. I think developing trust is probably one of the most important to facilitate collaboration. But going back to research, the research issue, I think engaging research institutions to collect data and analyze data and employ big data analytics to create solutions is very important. You may not know, but 6 universities representing Texas, Louisiana, and Florida have gotten together to create the Hurricane Resiliency Research Institute. And that was prompted from HUD money, CDBG funding going to Texas, and administered through the GLO unit there. And apparently 10% of that, $750 million, will be allocated to research of how to really find solutions for the problems that were created specifically in Houston, but throughout Texas. All 6 universities have collaborated, invested funding in this to actually come up with solutions. So I think engaging these research institutions and to provide solutions for the entire Gulf specifically, but perhaps beyond that, would be very important.
I think that's an excellent point. Mike had mentioned the sort of trusted source of the federal government as a possible agreed upon source of data, but I think the consortium of universities, and for example, every single one of our state universities has a water resource research center that I know in some of the states that I'm familiar with is a very trusted source for both research and data. Thoughts?
Absolutely agree. I think having academia weighing in, providing that scientific base of information, validating information is incredibly important. It's even better, just kind of putting on my DC political perspective, an alliance of universities across multiple states, even better. I think it's trusted, and it's also touches the bases of everybody's getting a part. And I think, at the federal level, I think that's one of at least the non-controversial aspects of federal involvement is funding basic science, improving our knowledge about our systems.
I'd like to add that there are all these kind of unexpected benefits of letting academic institutions lead with data collection. And one is the mentoring of the future scientists and the collegial relationships across institutions, which will promote the long-term sustainability of the data set or of the effort. And I think it would be wonderful to see a bigger commitment by the federal government to let universities be the places where data collection and data management happens. These sort of cross-university partnerships would be ideal, and then fall back on those, rely on those places with the support of the federal government.
Jean,
and
well,
the only
with your
thing,
thoughts.
yeah, the only thing that I'd like to add is that in higher ed and research can act as an honest broker. So they are just 1 step, 2 steps away, and so so again, that's a way to develop a trust in the science.
Really good point. I'm sorry that we're not getting to all the questions, but I think we're running out of time. Would you join me in thanking this wonderful set of
thoughts before we break. There is a real logic to the way this conference was set up. You heard about the macro issues in the first panel. You looked at the two largest watersheds in the United States. You're now about to hear what was referenced earlier today, the importance of cities and the application of science and data to cities, so that'll be our next panel. This afternoon, you will be immersed in the people who are gathering that data and visualizing it. So just a reminder about how we're moving from a sequence of macro to micro. So we'll see you all back here in just a few minutes. Thank you.